8,000 years ago, somewhere along a slow bend in central China, a human being pressed a grain of wild rice into wet mud and watched it grow. That single act, repeated, refined, passed from hand to hand, fed the dynasties. It built the cities. It drew the first Chinese characters into being. It cradled one of the longest, unbroken civilizations on Earth. The river that watered that grain is called the Chongqing, the Long River. In the West, we call it the Yangtze. In the summer of 1931, that same river rose out of its bed, covered an area larger than England and half of Scotland combined, and in a single flood season killed an estimated 3.7 million people. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in recorded human history. The river that built an empire drowned an empire. And the dam that was meant to end the bargain moved 1.4 million people out of their homes to do it. This is the Yangtze, 6,300 kilometers long, the longest river in Asia, the third longest on Earth. It begins at 5,342 meters above sea level, beneath a glacier on the Tibetan Plateau, as a stream of meltwater 3 meters wide and 20 centimeters deep. It ends 4,000 kilometers later at Shanghai, a megacity of 26 million people, pouring the Yangtze's silt into the East China Sea at a rate of 30,000 cubic meters every second. In between, it passes through 11 provinces. It waters nearly 1/3 of China's population. Its basin produces a quarter of China's food. It holds the world's largest hydroelectric dam, the deepest river gorges on any continent, the ruins of submerged 2,000-year-old cities, and the memory of creatures that no human being will ever see again. To travel the Yangtze is to travel a single, continuous argument between a civilization and the water that made it possible. The story begins in a place almost nobody goes. The Tanggula Mountains sit at the eastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau, in the western reaches of Shanghai province. This is high country. The valley floor, where the Yangtze is born, sits at roughly 4,700 meters, higher than the summit of most mountains in Europe. The air carries less than 60% of the oxygen at sea level. Winter temperatures fall below -30 degrees Celsius. For most of the year, the land here is frozen. And yet, people live here. The Tibetans who inhabit the source region call the upper river by a different name. Not Changjiang, not Yangtze. They call it the Drichu, the river of the female yak. Their ancestors named it long before the Han Chinese names were applied downstream. For them, this is not a Chinese river that happens to rise in Tibetan territory. This is a Tibetan river that happens to empty, very far away, into a Chinese sea. The true source is a place called the Jianggendiru Glacier, tucked beneath the 5,800-meter peak of Jeladandong Mountain. Chinese scientists debated for decades which tributary to call the headwater. There are 3 candidates: the Tuotuo, the Dangku, and the Chumer. After surveys conducted in the 1970s and 80s, the Tuotuo was officially recognized as the main source, a braided stream of glacial meltwater that drains southeast from the ice. In Mongolian, Tuo means rushing red river. The water carries sediment the color of old copper. It moves slowly at first because the land barely slopes here. Then it gathers. For the first 500 kilometers, the Yangtze is not a river as most travelers would recognize one. It is a network of shallow channels braiding across a frozen plateau, gathering between salt pans and small lakes, widening and narrowing with the season. There are no towns, no bridges, no permanent roads. Topographical maps of this region, even today, contain blank zones marked as surveyed only by satellite. This is the part of the Yangtze that produced almost none of the history you will hear about in this documentary, and yet, without this part, none of the rest would exist. Everything downstream, the rice paddies, the shipyards, the drowned cities, the dams, the flooded plains where 3 million people died in a single summer, all of it begins as frozen water on a mountain in Tibet. And this high country is not empty. It is one of the last refuges of a bird that exists almost nowhere else on Earth. The black-necked crane is the only crane species that breeds on the Shanghai Tibet Plateau. It stands nearly 1.5 meters tall. Its body is a soft, ashy gray. Its head, neck, and tail feathers are deep black. A small patch of bare red skin marks the crown, like a rank insignia worn by a retired officer. For centuries, black-necked cranes were sacred in Tibetan Buddhism. The cranes were believed to carry the souls of the 6th Dalai Lama between his incarnations. Killing one was spiritually unthinkable. The birds, perhaps responding to that protection, nested in the marshes around Buddhist monasteries for generations. They feed in the shallow wetlands near the Yangtze's source. They eat plant roots, seeds, insects, and small frogs. In early spring, the males perform a leaping, wing-spread courtship display, arcing into the cold air and settling again, as if testing the sky. They mate for life. A breeding pair will return to the same patch of wetland year after year until one of them dies. There are perhaps 10,000 left in the world. Around 3,000 of them breed on the marshes of the upper Yangtze. As the glaciers retreat and the wetlands dry, the margins of their world grow thinner each decade. They have outlasted empires. They may not outlast us. The Yangtze flows east across the plateau for roughly 800 kilometers, gathering water from dozens of small tributaries. Then, the land begins to drop. Between the Tibetan Plateau and the Sichuan Basin, the river loses nearly 4,000 meters of elevation in a stretch of mountains so dense and so steep that for most of human history, they were considered impassable. This is where the Yangtze stops behaving like a plateau stream and starts behaving like a knife. The river makes a turn here that almost defies geology. Having traveled southeast for over 1,000 kilometers, it approaches the border of Yunnan, and then, at a place called Shigu, it bends back on itself at a sharp 180-degree angle and begins flowing northeast. The locals call it the first bend of the Yangtze. Geographers call it a river capture, the consequence of mountain uplift rerouting ancient drainage systems over millions of years. If that bend had gone the other way, the Yangtze would have continued south into what is now Vietnam, joining the Red River and emptying into the Gulf of Chongqing. There would be no Changjiang. There would be no Three Gorges. The entire shape of Chinese civilization, its agriculture, its cities, its history, would have happened somewhere else, or not at all. 100 kilometers downstream of that turn, the river enters what may be the deepest canyon on any continent. Tiger Leaping Gorge cuts between two snow-capped peaks, Jade Dragon Snow Mountain on the east, rising to 5,596 meters, and Haba Snow Mountain on the west at 5,396. From the summit of Jade Dragon to the surface of the river below, the vertical drop is 3,790 meters. For comparison, the Grand Canyon, at its deepest, is 1,857 meters. Tiger Leaping Gorge is more than twice as deep. The canyon is 15 kilometers long and narrows in places to just 25 meters across. A local legend says a tiger, pursued by hunters, once leapt the entire width of the river using a boulder in the middle as a stepping stone. That boulder is still there. The tiger, presumably, got away. The indigenous people of the gorge are the Naxi. They are believed to descend from Tibetan nomads who settled in these valleys more than 1,000 years ago. Their numbers are small, perhaps 300,000 total, but they preserve something remarkable. The Naxi developed their own writing system called Dongba script. It is pictographic, composed of small illustrations rather than letters. Linguists consider it one of the last pictographic writing systems still in active use anywhere on Earth. Older Naxi villages along the gorge still maintain a matrilineal family structure. Property passes through the mother's line. In some communities, marriage, as outsiders understand it, does not exist. Couples visit each other at night, but keep separate households, and children are raised by the mother's family. Chinese governments have tried at various times to dismantle the practice. It persists. Below Tiger Leaping Gorge, the river finally slows. It has dropped nearly all of its plateau elevation. It turns east into the Sichuan Basin, and at the city of Yibin, the Jinsha River officially ends, and the Chongqing, the Yangtze proper, begins. This is the China most travelers picture when they think of China. Rice paddies terraced into hills, bamboo forests, river mist rising off warm water, villages with grey tiled roofs, small boats, old men fishing with cormorants. It is also the most densely populated river valley on the planet. Within 100 kilometers of Yibin, the Yangtze will pass Chongqing, one of the largest cities in China and almost certainly the strangest. Chongqing is built vertically. The city sprawls across a mountainous peninsula where the Yangtze meets its largest tributary, the Jialing River. The terrain is so severe that entire neighborhoods exist on cliff faces. Apartment blocks rise 30 stories above roads that are themselves already built on rooftops. A city metro line passes directly through the 6th floor of a residential building. Locals call Chongqing the 8D city because regular three-dimensional maps cannot describe it. The Greater Chongqing municipality contains over 32 million people. That is more than the entire population of Australia, compressed into a river junction where two water systems collide. And in the river below, for most of recorded history, swam a creature that has now vanished entirely. The Chinese paddlefish was one of the largest freshwater fish that ever lived. Adults regularly reached 3 meters in length. The largest ever reliably recorded was 7 meters long and weighed over 400 kilograms. Its snout extended forward like a long, flattened sword. Locals called it the elephant fish. The paddlefish had survived for roughly 200 million years. It swam through the Sichuan Basin while dinosaurs still walked around the river's edges. It was there when the first humans domesticated rice. It was there when Chow Chow's fleet sailed south toward the Battle of Red Cliffs. The last confirmed sighting was in 2003. In 2022, it was officially declared extinct. "200 million years, gone within 1 century of industrial fishing, dam construction, and pollution." The Yangtze is not yet the deadliest flood river in the world at this stage of its journey. It is still in the upper reaches, still in the mountains, still moving fast. The violence comes later, but first, it must pass through the gorges. East of Chongqing, the Yangtze enters a canyon system that has shaped Chinese poetry, painting, and mythology for over 2,000 years. 3 gorges, Kutang, Wu, and Xiling, stretched for roughly 200 kilometers through mountains that rise 1,000 meters straight up from the water. In places, the river narrowed to 100 meters across. Strong currents, hidden shoals, and seasonal floods made this stretch one of the most dangerous navigable waterways in the world. For most of Chinese history, boats could only be pulled upstream by teams of men walking along narrow paths carved into the cliff faces. These were called trackers. They harnessed themselves to long bamboo ropes and hauled cargo vessels up the gorges, meter by meter, sometimes for weeks. The paths they walked are still visible today, faint grooves worn into the limestone, 2,000 years old. Halfway through the gorges sits a place called Fengdu, the ghost city. For roughly 2,000 years, Fengdu has been culturally associated with the afterlife. Chinese Taoist and Buddhist traditions identified it as the gateway to the underworld, the place where, after death, souls come to be judged before reincarnation. The name came from a coincidence of language. 2 Taoist mystics named Yin and Wang were said to have achieved immortality here. Over centuries, their combined surnames, Yin Wang, came to sound identical to the Chinese word for the king of hell. The old town of Fengdu sat on the north bank of the river, beneath a hill called Ming Mountain. The hill was covered in temples, some dating to the Tang dynasty. There was a bridge called Nai He Chiao, the Bridge of No Return, which the dead were said to cross before forgetting their past lives. There was a gate called Gui Men Guan, the gateway to hell. There were stone statues of the 10 kings of the underworld. There was a temple fair held every spring that reenacted the judgment of souls. The old town of Fengdu, at the base of the hill, was a working river community. 2,000 years of continuous occupation. Homes, markets, piers, a bridge from the Ming dynasty, ancient graveyards where families had been buried for 20 generations. It is all underwater now. In 2003, the reservoir behind the Three Gorges Dam began to fill. The old town of Fengdu disappeared beneath 30 meters of water. The ghost temples on the hill survived because they had been built on high ground. Everything below, the homes, the markets, the piers, the bridge, the graveyards, was submerged. A new Fengdu was constructed on the opposite bank of the river, on higher ground. It is a planned city. The The streets are wide, the apartments are new, the supermarkets are modern. The residents were moved, over several years, from the old town to the new. Most of them did not want to go. One former resident, an elderly furniture maker interviewed by an artist who visited in 2013, was asked why he always painted grapes on the scrap wood he worked with. He said, "I paint grapes. My master painted grapes. My master's master painted grapes." He could not explain it further. That was the answer. Every displaced community along the Yangtze contains 1,000 such answers. Practices, habits, family recipes, jokes that only make sense in a particular dialect, ways of tying a rope, particular angles at which certain temples caught certain kinds of afternoon light. None of it is stored anywhere. When the town goes under, the answers go with it. But long before the dam, long before the floods, long before even the name Chongqing was in use, this stretch of river witnessed one of the most consequential battles in Chinese history. It is winter of 208 AD. Cao Cao, the northern warlord who has conquered most of China under the name of the Han Dynasty, is sailing down the Yangtze with a fleet of somewhere between 200,000 and 800,000 men. His plan is to cross the river, defeat the southern warlords, and unify the empire. He is already at this moment the most powerful man in China. Against him stand two smaller warlords, Sun Quan, who controls the lower Yangtze, and Liu Bei, a distant relative of the imperial family. Together, they can muster perhaps 50,000 soldiers. They have one advantage. Cao Cao's northern troops are not sailors. They are getting seasick on the river. To stabilize his fleet, Cao Cao orders his ships lashed together into a single floating platform. The ships stop rocking. His men recover. He prepares to cross. A southern commander named Huang Gai sends Cao Cao a letter. He claims he wishes to defect. He says he will sail across with his own ships and join the northern cause. Cao Cao accepts. On the agreed evening, Huang Gai's ships sail toward Cao Cao's lashed fleet. They are loaded with kindling, oil, and dried reeds. As they near the northern vessels, Huang Gai's sailors set fire to their own ships and leap into smaller boats trailing behind. The fire ships crash into Cao Cao's floating platform. The wind that night is blowing northwest. The flames spread through the chained fleet faster than any crew can cut the ropes. Cao Cao loses, by most historical estimates, half of his army that night. The survivors flee north, many dying of dysentery on the march home. The warlord never again commands a force large enough to conquer the south. The Battle of Red Cliffs ends the Han Dynasty's last chance at reunification. It divides China into three kingdoms, Wei, Shu, and Wu, and the north-south political division it creates will shape Chinese geography for 18 centuries. Most of what is remembered today about that battle comes from a 14th century novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which added fire omens and prophetic winds to the historical record. But the river, the lashed ships, the fire, and the end of an empire, those parts are real. Archaeologists still debate the exact location along the Yangtze where it happened. The cliffs remain, the water still flows past them. Downstream from the gorges, the Yangtze enters a landscape that will define everything about what comes next. This is the middle reach, the floodplain. Here, the river widens, the land flattens, the mountains recede into distant foothills. The Yangtze meanders across a plain so low and so level that in places the river's surface sits 7 meters higher than the surrounding farmland. Only a thousands of kilometers long network of earthen dikes keeps the farms and cities from being drowned every single summer by the river they depend on. This is the most fertile land in China. It produces rice, wheat, cotton, tea, mulberries for silk,
and tobacco
on a scale that has fed the country for millennia. It contains, along with the delta downstream, roughly 400 million people. The fertility is not an accident. 2,270 years ago, in a region just west of here, along a major Yangtze tributary, a Qin dynasty governor named Li Bing was confronted with a seasonal flooding problem that was destroying the farms of the Chengdu Plain. His solution, completed around 256 BC, is still in active use today. The system is called Dujiangyan. Rather than damming the river, Li Bing split it. He engineered a long earthen fish-mouth levee that divided the tributary into an inner and an outer channel. The outer channel carried excess floodwater away. The inner channel fed a controlled irrigation network. In flood season, about 60% of the water went outer. In dry season, the ratio reversed. About 60% went inner to feed the fields. Li Bing had no concrete. He had no steel. His engineers cut their spillways through solid rock using a technique of heating stone with fire, then cooling it suddenly with river water until the rock cracked. It took 8 years. The Dujiangyan system has functioned continuously for 23 centuries. It still irrigates over 5,000 square kilometers of farmland on the Chengdu Plain. No human engineering project anywhere on Earth has operated for so long, so continuously, without fundamental redesign. It is a useful thing to hold in mind before we discuss what happened in the 20th century. The Chinese understood how to live with the Yangtze. They had been doing it for 2,000 years. The question is whether what came next, the dams, the flood walls, the reservoirs, is a continuation of that tradition or a departure from it. And it is also where the river has killed, by a margin that is almost impossible to comprehend, more human beings than any other natural feature on Earth. At the heart of this plain stands the city of Wuhan. 9 million people, the largest city in central China. It sits at the confluence of the Yangtze and its major northern tributary, the Han River. For 2,000 years, Wuhan has been called the 9 provinces thoroughfare, the place where every major river route in central China converges. Wuhan is also where, in the summer of 1931, the Yangtze rose to a level 16 meters above its average seasonal height and refused to come down. The story of the 1931 flood begins, paradoxically, with 3 years of drought. From 1928 through 1930, much of central China received below-average rainfall. The dikes along the Yangtze, which required continuous maintenance, were neglected because the country was in the middle of a civil war. Resources went to armies. The dikes settled, cracked, and weakened. Then the weather turned. In the spring of 1931, torrential rains began across the Yangtze watershed. They continued through April, through May, through June. By July, The river was higher than anyone living could remember. On the 19th of August, the gauge at Hangkou, the old commercial heart of Wuhan, recorded a water level of 53 feet above average. An average person's house in the lower reaches was already underwater. On the 25th of August, the dikes around the city of Gaoyu gave way. A wall of water swept across the plain overnight. Between 10 and 15,000 people drowned in a single night. That was the beginning. The floodwaters eventually covered 180,000 square kilometers, an area the size of England, Scotland combined. They reached the cities of Nanjing and Wuhan. They drowned farms across 8 provinces. The initial drownings were only the first killers. Cholera, dysentery, malaria, and typhoid followed the floodwaters. Rice crops were destroyed. Food prices collapsed, then spiked. Survivors ate tree bark. They ate clay. Contemporary reports, not rumor, not legend, but field surveys conducted by the University of Nanjing and the Chinese government documented instances of cannibalism. Parents sold their children for food. Some children were sold for the equivalent of a single American dollar. The final death toll is disputed. The most conservative estimates place direct drownings at around 140,000. The full mortality from drowning, starvation, and disease over the next year is estimated by most scholars at between 2 and 3.7 million people. By any measure, it remains the deadliest flood in recorded human history. By many measures, the deadliest natural disaster of any kind. More people died in that one summer than in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, multiplied by 10. And in 8 provinces, 40 million people were left homeless, a number so large that foreign relief agencies arriving months later could not comprehend what they were seeing. A Dragon King temple had been demolished in Wuhan shortly before the floods as part of an anti-superstition campaign. Afterwards, the city's mayor, under intense public pressure, personally led a ceremony kowtowing to the deity he had helped destroy. It did not help. The water had already made its point. There is a phrase that appears in Chinese folk memory about the 1931 flood. It translates roughly as, "The river took back what was lent." "23 years later, in 1954, it happened again. Not on the same scale, but enough to kill 30,000 people and submerge most of the same cities. 44 years after that, in 1998, it happened a third time. 3,700 dead, 15 million homeless, $24 billion in damage. By that third flood, in 1998, the Chinese government had already decided. The river could no longer be trusted with the country's future. Every generation, it would take its tribute. Every generation, tens of thousands would die. Something had to change. The something that changed is, even now, the most controversial infrastructure project in human history. And the man who warned, from the very beginning, that it would not work, spent 40 years being told he was wrong. His name was Huang Wanli. Huang Wanli was a hydraulic engineer trained at Cornell University in the 1930s. He returned to China, believing that his country needed modern dams to modernize. In the early 1950s, he was one of the senior engineers consulted about the first proposed dam on the Yellow River, the Sanmenxia Dam. Huang warned that the Yellow River carried too much sediment. The reservoir would silt up within a decade. The engineering, he said, was not sound. He was told to be quiet. He refused. In 1957, during the anti-rightist campaign, he was officially labeled a rightist, a political crime that ended his career, stripped him of his Cornell credentials, and exiled him to hard labor. His predictions about Sanmenxia proved exactly correct. The dam silted up. Huang was never publicly vindicated. When the Three Gorges proposal was revived in the 1980s, Huang, by then in his 70s, wrote directly to every senior Chinese leader he could still reach. He explained that the Yangtze, like the Yellow River, carried enormous sediment loads. He explained that the proposed reservoir would trap that sediment. He explained that downstream of the dam, deprived of its normal sediment flow, the river channel would erode, the floodplain would subside, and the agricultural delta downstream would slowly begin to drown from the sea. He was ignored. Huang Wanli died in 2001, 5 years before the Three Gorges Reservoir reached its full capacity. He was 99 years old. He had been right about the Yellow River. He had been right about the Yangtze. Neither victory was acknowledged in his lifetime. His letters still exist in university archives. Engineering students read them. The government does not discuss them. Downstream from Wuhan, the river enters its broadest and gentlest stretch. This is the country of the Great Lakes. Chongqing and Poyang, two of the largest freshwater lakes in China, both connected to the main Yangtze Channel by networks of smaller rivers. These lakes breathe with the Yangtze. When the river floods, water rushes out of the main channel into the lakes, expanding their surface area by orders of magnitude. When the river falls, water drains back out. The rhythm has shaped the entire ecology of central China for millions of years. And it is here, in the wetlands around these lakes, that the final, still living member of one of the world's most tragic animal stories still swims. The Yangtze finless porpoise is a small cetacean, just over 1.5 meters long, smooth-backed, with no dorsal fin at all. It has a gentle, curved mouth that looks, in certain light, like it is smiling. Researchers who have studied it say its intelligence is comparable to that of a gorilla. It recognizes itself in mirrors. It appears to understand a handful of gestures from human handlers. There are roughly 1,000 left in the world. 20 years ago, there were 2 cetacean species in the Yangtze. The finless porpoise was always rare. The other, the baiji, the Yangtze River dolphin, was slightly more common, though also declining. The baiji was not just another river dolphin, it was its own entire mammal family. Its closest relatives had diverged from all other cetaceans tens of millions of years ago. There were river dolphins in the Amazon, in the Indus, in the Ganges. But the baiji was unlike any of them. A single lineage, preserved in a single river, a living fossil. Local fishermen called it the goddess of the Yangtze. It was said to bring luck. For centuries, killing one was considered cursed. In 2006, a joint Chinese international expedition spent 6 weeks sailing the entire lower Yangtze, from Yichang to Shanghai, using both visual observation and underwater acoustic monitoring. 2 research vessels, 1,669 kilometers of river, every known baiji habitat. They found nothing. The expedition scientists were careful. They did not declare the species extinct. They declared it functionally extinct, meaning that even if a few individuals still existed somewhere, the population was too small to recover. The baiji was the first large vertebrate driven to extinction by human activity in more than 50 years. It was the first cetacean species ever eliminated by humans. A living animal lineage, tens of millions of years old, ended in our lifetime. Because of overfishing, because of ship collisions, because of dams, because of pollution, because of 1,000 small decisions, none of which individually felt like the one that killed it. Samuel Turvey, the British zoologist who led much of the search, said later that the baiji was unique and beautiful, unrelated to anything else. There was nothing quite like it. He spent more than 2 decades trying to find one. He never did. The finless porpoise is now all that is left of the Yangtze's original cetaceans. Conservationists have established 2 protected oxbow lakes, relocating small breeding populations. They have created a captive research facility at Wuhan. They are trying, as gently as possible, not to repeat what was done to the baiji. The population is still declining, not as fast as before, but still declining. Whether the finless porpoise survives the next century depends entirely on choices not yet made. About fishing, about shipping, about water quality, about whether a country that has already lost one river dolphin can bear to lose another. The Yangtze continues east. The land flattens further. The river widens to several kilometers across. This is the lower reach, the oldest continuously occupied region of China, the breadbasket of the dynasties, the place where Chinese civilization stopped being a collection of tribes and became an empire. At the city of Nanjing, the Yangtze makes one of its final great bends before turning toward the sea. Nanjing has been the capital of China many times, during the Eastern Jin dynasty, during the Southern Song, during the Ming dynasty, during the Republic of China. Its name means Southern Capital, the counterpart to Beijing, the Northern Capital. The city walls, built in the 14th century by the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty, are still among the longest and best preserved city walls anywhere on Earth. They stretch for 35 kilometers. A person can still walk the top of them. On a hill just outside Nanjing stands the tomb of that first Ming emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang. The tomb complex is massive. Stone animals line the approach. Stone guardians stand watch at the gate. A raised processional path leads to the burial chamber itself. The emperor's body was placed there in 1398. It has not been disturbed since. Nanjing has also at times been the site of almost unspeakable suffering. In December of 1937, after the city fell to the Japanese Imperial Army, what followed over the next 6 weeks, the massacres, the mass rapes, the disposal of bodies into the Yangtze, remains one of the most brutal episodes of the 20th century. The scale is disputed. Most historians estimate between 200,000 and 300,000 people were killed. The river, once again, carried the dead. There is a memorial in Nanjing today, built on one of the mass grave sites. Outside the main hall is a large sculpture of a weeping woman. Her hands cover her face. The name of the sculpture, translated loosely, is Disaster of the fallen city. Beyond Nanjing, the Yangtze begins to spread. It loses its sharp banks. It braids into channels. Islands rise and disappear with the seasons. Eventually, in the delta region, the river no longer has one bed. It has dozens, fanning out across a plain of rice paddies, canals, and cities. This is the Yangtze Delta. 10% of China's population lives here. 20% of China's gross domestic product is generated here. It is one of the most economically dense patches of land on Earth. At the easternmost end stands Shanghai, 26 million people, the most populous urban area in China. A city that did not exist in any significant form until the 1800s, when the river's silt, slowly extending the delta east into the ocean, created enough new land to accommodate the settlers who came. Shanghai is, quite literally, built on material the Yangtze carried down from Tibet. Every grain of sand in Pudong's skyscraper foundations, every handful of soil in a Shanghai garden, every meter of shoreline. All of it was once frozen water on a Tibetan glacier, washed east for 4,000 kilometers and deposited at the mouth of the river 2 million years worth of such deposits ago. The Yangtze does not just feed China, it builds it, sediment by sediment, over geological time. And that brings us finally to the place where everything in this documentary comes together. The place that changed the Yangtze more than any event in human history.
The place that exists
because of 1931, and because of every other flood that preceded it, and because of every engineer, including Huang Wanli, who warned against it, and because of every leader who decided that the river could no longer be allowed to rule. It is called the Three Gorges Dam. The dam stands at Sandoping in Hubei province, about 38 kilometers west of the city of Yichang. It is a gravity dam, meaning it holds back water by sheer weight. Its concrete wall is 2,335 meters long. Its maximum height above the original rock basin is 181 meters. 27 million cubic meters of concrete were poured into its construction, enough to build a concrete highway stretching from Beijing to Paris. When the reservoir is at full pool, the dam holds back 39 cubic kilometers of water. The reservoir itself is 660 kilometers long, stretching from Yichang all the way back upstream past Fengdu, past the three gorges themselves, almost to Chongqing. The dam was first proposed by Sun Yat-sen in 1919. It was revived by Mao Zedong in 1953. It was fought over by engineers for 40 years. In 1992, after multiple delays, the Chinese National People's Congress finally approved construction. Almost a third of the delegates abstained or voted against the project, an unprecedented sign of dissent from what is normally a compliant body. Construction began in 1994. The dam wall was completed in 2006. The first turbines came online that same year. The last of 32 main turbines began generating power in 2012. A ship lift capable of raising 3,000-ton passenger vessels in 21 minutes was finished in 2016. At full capacity, the dam generates 22,500 megawatts. It is the largest power station by installed capacity in human history. In a typical year, it produces nearly 100 terawatt-hours of electricity. That is enough to meet the annual needs of roughly 200 million people. It is also the largest peacetime population displacement in human history. To make room for the reservoir, the Chinese government moved 1,300,000 people. Some sources place the figure as high as 1.4 million. Two entire cities, 114 towns, and 1,680 villages were completely submerged. 632 square kilometers of land, including some of the most productive farmland in central China, disappeared underwater. Over 1,300 archaeological sites were lost or salvaged and relocated. The old town of Fengdu, as we have already seen. Parts of the 1,000-year-old pagoda fortress at Shibaozhai, now on an island. The Ming Dynasty bridges, the trackers' paths along the gorges, the ancestral graveyards, thousands of years of continuously inhabited places gone in under a decade. Of the families displaced, a 30-year study conducted by the World Bank found that approximately one-third re-established their lives at satisfactory standards. Another third rebuilt only subsistence livelihoods. The final third, hundreds of thousands of people, remained, decades later, mired in poverty. A contemporary report published in the run-up to the dam's completion put the matter simply, announcing that 4 million people had to be moved due to the Three Gorges Dam was an acknowledgement of the powerlessness of local authorities faced with a risk of major disaster. The relocation policy, as originally designed, was that most displaced rural families would be resettled nearby, on newly cleared land within the same region. That land turned out not to exist. Slopes that had been deemed reclaimable were, in practice, steep, erosion-prone, and ecologically fragile. Clearing them made the downstream flooding worse. In 1998, while the dam was still under construction, the catastrophic Yangtze floods were blamed, in part, on the deforestation caused by the resettlement program the dam itself had triggered. The government's final approach was to relocate families far away, to Shanghai, to Jiangsu, to Guangdong. Younger people adapted. Older people often did not. Interviews with elderly displaced villagers, conducted decades later, frequently circle back to the same phrase. We were farmers. Now we are nothing. And yet, the dam works. The 2010 flood season, the most severe in decades, was the first real test. The dam's reservoir absorbed water inflows at more than 70,000 cubic meters per second. Downstream water levels stayed below the levels that had caused the 1998 catastrophe. Hundreds, possibly thousands of downstream lives were almost certainly saved. The dam does what it was built to do. But it was built to solve the problem of the Yangtze, as the Yangtze existed in the 20th century. The river of the 21st century is becoming a different river. In the summer of 2022, the Yangtze Basin suffered what meteorologists now describe as the most severe drought in the 70 years of reliable records. Rainfall across the entire basin fell more than 40% below the long-term average. Surface air temperatures averaged 2 degrees Celsius higher than normal. Tributaries dried up. Lakes shrank. Poyang Lake, China's largest freshwater lake, dropped to less than 25% of its normal surface area. Farmland cracked. Crops failed across 4 million hectares. Hydroelectric output at the Three Gorges Dam collapsed because the dam, for all its flood control power, cannot generate electricity from water that does not exist. 4.3 million people experienced drinking water shortages at the peak of the drought. Power rationing was imposed across Sichuan province. Some cities turned off elevators in high-rise buildings, factories closed. Scientific attribution studies have since concluded that the event had a natural return period of roughly 1,000 years under pre-industrial climate conditions. Under current climate conditions, with anthropogenic warming, it has become more than 10 times more likely. The dam was built for a river that flooded. The river is now increasingly also a river that fails to flow. One warning in a single year is not a conclusion, but the trend is unmistakable. The glaciers at the Yangtze's source are shrinking. The plateau wetlands, where the black-necked cranes breed, are drying. The rainfall patterns across the basin are shifting from reliable summer monsoons toward increasingly extreme oscillations. Flood, drought, flood. The river that the engineers of the 1950s set out to tame is not the river the dam now faces. At the Yangtze's source, on the plateau, the Tibetans who call the river the Drichu still herd yaks across marshes that get a little smaller each decade. The black-necked cranes still return, in pairs, to the same breeding wetlands their ancestors used. The glacial stream still emerges, 3 meters wide and copper-red, from under the ice. At the mouth of the river, in Shanghai, the Pudong skyline rises over land that did not exist 200 years ago. Soil that the Drichu carried down, one sediment grain at a time, from under the Tangula ice. In between, a civilization is trying to decide what kind of relationship it is going to have for the next 100 years with the most important river in its history. The dam is permanent. The displaced are still rebuilding. The baiji is gone.
The paddlefish is gone.
The porpoise is still alive, but only just. The cranes still fly. The Yangtze has fed every dynasty that ever ruled China. It has drowned more people than any other natural feature on Earth. It has built cities out of Tibetan ice and buried them under its own reservoir. It has carried the dead and the memories of the dead and the silt that will become the homes of the living yet unborn. It was here before us. It will be here after us. What it will take from us next, what we have already taken from it, is not yet settled. The river is still moving. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next journey.